Hello everyone and welcome to another very nice game from the Niksic tournament of 1983. This is the penultimate round and Kasparov faces a most unpleasant opponent in the form of Dutch Grandmaster Jan Timman, who is having a pretty good tournament. And one other thing that's really important is that Kasparov has never defeated him. This is their fourth game altogether up until 1983, and two were drawn and one was a loss at the 1981 Tilburg tournament, where Timman won a very nice game in 40 moves. Interestingly, in all those three games, Kasparov had the black pieces, and now in the fourth encounter, he also gets the black pieces. So, it's luck of the draw. Nothing to be done about that. And Timman being a little bit older, Kasparov is 20 here. Timman is 32. Timman's been around for quite some time now. His first big international victory was in 1972-73 when he won shared first with Mikhail Tal in the Great Hastings tournament, and he also has been part of the sort of the candidate cycle, not really qualifying for the candidates, but he has been trying to qualify. He tried in 1972 and 75, and then this year in 83 he even qualified, and then he lost to Zoltan Ribli. But yeah, obviously very strong. Kasparov is here world number 2, only Karpov is world number 1, as Karpov, like I said, is the only 2700 player at the time, and Timman was around world number 12, maybe 13, around that. So yeah, let's check it out. It's a very exciting game, and also for Kasparov, I believe, a very memorable one. So Timman with white opens with pawn to e3. We have pawn to c5 by Garry. Sorry about that. Knight to f3. We have pawn to d6 and pawn to d4. So the standard open Sicilian, we have captures, knight captures on d4, knight to f6, we have knight to c3, and Kasparov goes for the Najdorf variation that he is famous for, amongst other things. We have bishop to g5 and pawn to e6. We have pawn to f4 and queen to c7. Bishop captures on f6, we have g captures and bishop to e2. So a very standard line. It was played back then, it's played nowadays. Everyone knows it, everyone loves to play it. Knight to c6, we have queen to d2, bishop to d7, and castles queenside. We have pawn to h5 and king to b1, bishop to e7. You could also castle queenside here. Kasparov first decides to develop the bishop, and now there are a couple of games that reach this position, but after bishop to f3, it is now as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. Okay, Kasparov trades once on d4, captures, and now he decides to castle queenside. Someone mentioned in the comments on this game on chessgames.com that Kasparov always used to castle here, but in modern days when he faced, let's say, Vishwanathan Anand or Jordan Van Forest, he used to keep his king in the center of the board, although that's when Kasparov, comes once a year to play some rapid chess, then he also, I guess, decides to have a little bit of fun. So, okay, castles queenside, we have pawn to f5 and king to b8, not allowing any tricky queen to a7 action. Queen back to d2, freeing up the d4 square for the knight, so the knight is to be remaneuvered, and Kasparov grabs more space on the king side, h4. Knight to e2 and bishop to c8 will be very useful, as once the position opens up or this pawn gets pushed forward, this bishop could be a very strong attacker, so it does come in handy to have a bishop on c8. We have f captures on e6, a sort of an unprovoked capture. Maybe some other moves can be played as well, like rook h1 or maybe h3, stopping Kasparov from advancing h3, but he decides to break the tension in the center, captures, and goes knight to f4 instead. Okay, maybe some knight to g6, also putting some pressure on the e6 pawn. So rook h to g8 and queen to e3. We have rook to g5. Now the rook can easily be shifted into the attack via the queen side. We have rook to d3. Bishop to f8. The bishop now can come to g7 and put pressure along this diagonal. And rook h to d1. Jan doubles up on the d file. We have bishop to h6, sort of preparing some very nasty discoveries here, and knight to e2. There aren't any, so you can't really gain anything, but Kasparov does find pawn to h3. And what can you do? Of course, capturing looks a little bit weird. It's even the top move recommended by the engine, but it just looks a little bit weird. So Jan plays pawn to g3 and now rook to h5, sort of allowing the bishop to capture the rook, but not really, as the queen is attacked as well. Queen back to f2, and now rook to c5 by Garry. We have knight to d4 and rook to c4. We have queen to e2 and rook to g8. We have pawn to b3, chasing away the rook, even though, again, perhaps an unprovoked push. Rook to c5, and now queen to f2, putting some pressure on that f2, f6 pawn. Once the bishop moves, we have rook to e5 and queen to f1. We have pawn to d5. Kasparov decides to strike in the center. Queen captures on h3. He decides that, okay, it's okay to give up the h3 pawn. D captures on e4. We have bishop captures on e4, and now bishop to g7, as your bishop on h6 is hanging. So Kasparov plays bishop to g7. And now best probably would be to bring the queen to g2. We'll put pressure on this g7 pawn, b7 pawn, and you won't run into any trouble. But here, bishop to f3 was played, and now Kasparov really has a chance of seizing the initiative. Now, you could just play something like queen to h8, and then once the queen moves, you're going to bring the rook to c5 and continue the attack that way. But Kasparov plays pawn to f5, which is not the most precise, but it will be the most interesting. He opens up the dark square bishop, and now look at this brilliant defensive maneuver by Jan. He plays pawn to b4, which is like, okay, usually the best move we know, and it's even the top engine move recommended by the engine in this position. Point is that you're not really in any danger of that pawn being captured, because even if something like queen e7, you're very happy to give it up, queen g2. And now if you capture rook b3, and black resigns, that's all there is to it. So after b4, we have rook to e4, a flashy move by Kasparov. But the rook isn't really an offering here. If you capture it, then f captures, attacks the rook, and not a lot of good moves you can do here. If you move the rook, then the pawn comes forward. If rook d3, then you just capture on d4. Rook captures pawn to e2, and after rook e1, let's say queen c3, and you lose the game. So you have to be very, very careful here. So pawn to c3, again, the best possible move by Jan, and Kasparov strikes with pawn to e5. And there is only one good move here, but it is not one that can be made easily. What would you play here if you were in this position playing against 20-year-old Garry Kasparov? So the tricky move is knight captures on f5. It looks like, yes, of course, you can capture it, but then you sort of self-pin yourself. And it's the only good move. Point is that now the rook is hanging, so you have to move the rook. And this is, of course, Kasparov's plan. He wants to capture that c3 pawn. But now you have time for queen h7, and there's not all that much for black to do here. You have to go for rook to h8, and then you trade. Queen captures, knight captures, and then pawn to e4. You win the material back, and if something like rook to d8, okay, you play rook captures, now you capture on f3, let's say rook f8, put the rook behind the passed pawn, rook captures on c3, and now you push the h-pawn, and okay, it's, playable by both, pretty much an equal position. But Kasparov managed to confuse him, and Jan went back. Knight to b3, which means that the c3 pawn is now lost. Kasparov just moves the rook c4, attacks the c3 pawn, and also is threatening pawn to e4. So you have to react. Bishop to d5. With an attack on both the rooks. The bishop sort of forking the rooks here. Rook to h8, also another reason why the queen had to come to g2 a little bit sooner, or f1. Queen to g2, and now Kasparov just gobbles up the c3 pawn. Rook captures on c3, rook captures, and queen captures on c3. Now the material is equal, but you can kind of feel that Kasparov controlling so much space, having the bishop pair on an open board, definitely has the advantage, a winning one at that. So queen to d2. Kasparov could trade queens, nothing wrong with that, but he decides to keep them. Queen to c7. He does have the safer king, so also makes sense. Knight to a5 and pawn to e4, opening up the dragon. We have knight to c4 and rook to d8. Now aligning the rook nicely with the white queen. We have queen to f4 and queen captures on f4. G captures and king to a7, knight to e3, and bishop to h6. So still very much to play for here, and Jan has shown in the tournament and in his life up to this point that he is a most resilient fighter. So he will not just give this up. We have rook to f1, defending the f4 pawn. Kasparov tries the other way, bishop to f4, attacks the b pawn, so a3, and just pawn to a5. And now Kasparov will either win the 2 pawns this way, or the way Jan does it. So Jan starts pushing pawn to h4, and Kasparov says, all right, I will have that pawn. A captures, bishop captures on b4, bishop to f7, ready to escort that pawn up the board, rook to d3. Attacking the knight, we have knight to d5 and bishop to a5. We have rook to f2 and bishop to d7, preparing to bring the bishop to a4. Rook to a2, attacking the bishop on a5, and pawn to b6. We have rook to c2 and bishop to a4. You don't want to see something like rook c7 check, so bishop to a4. Rook c7 check, but okay, now it will not cost you a piece. We have king to b8 and rook to e7. Bishop to b3, and here Kasparov is preparing a very nasty maneuver, but unfortunately for Jan, there is no way of stopping it. We have rook to e5, and now feel free to pause the video and try to find the simplest way for Kasparov to win this game while I give you a couple of seconds. Of course, the move is pawn to e3. And the point being that the bishop on f7 is undefended, so even though you're defending it twice, it doesn't really matter. Pawn to h5, he starts pushing, but now bishop captures on d5, bishop captures on d5, and rook captures on d5. And of course, the rook cannot be accepted. If you capture then pawn to e2 and you cannot stop the pawn, rook e5, you simply queen, complements of the bishop on a5, and the bishop is now, of course, dominant. If you try to push the pawn, the bishop can easily cover the queening square. So after rook captures on d5, rook captures on e3, and now rook to d1 check. Even down a piece, Jan still doesn't resign. King to c2, we have rook to h1, and rook to e8 with check. We have king to b7, rook to h8, defending the pass pawn, but now Kasparov's pass pawn also starts marching forward. b5, h6, we have rook to h2 check, king to d3, rook to h3 check, king to c2, and now pawn to b4. And he was in this position on move 66 that Jan Timman resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. The king is on the 7th rank, so there is no way of actually checking the king, so your pawn can march forward, and being down a piece, okay, this very, very quickly you are getting checkmated. So yeah, beautifully done by Kasparov, taking down Jan Timman for the first time. Like I said, this is their 4th encounter altogether. First time Kasparov beats him, and of course that's always a very, very special moment, as Jan was incredibly strong at that time, and Kasparov was trying to prove himself wherever he could, and this was one such occasion. There is one more game left in the Niksic tournament that we're going to cover by Kasparov. It's the game from the final round where he faces Svetozar Gligoric. Quite a nice game, so we're going to enjoy that as well. And then we move on to modern events and to even more prehistoric ones. So yeah, really hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Christian Medical and Professional Services, Peter Albert, Rajesh Kota, Phil Bawa, and Fisher Exteriors for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. And if you still haven't, do check out first link in the description below. You will love it. See you soon.